Have you ever felt like you were watching everyone else's life from inside a fish tank? Everyone seems to know the rules of a game that was never explained to you. People move with a social ease that looks automatic. They know when to speak, when to go quiet, how to laugh at exactly the right moment, how to enter and exit conversations without creating friction. And you watch all of this with a mixture of fascination and disorientation, trying to decode the pattern, trying to imitate enough of it to go unnoticed. But something always slips. Maybe it's too much. You get excited about something that only you find fascinating and realize too late that the people around you are slightly uncomfortable. Maybe it's too little. You don't react with the emotional intensity the situation seemed to demand, and someone gets hurt by something you genuinely didn't see. Maybe it's the timing. You get the joke 30 seconds after everyone else has already moved on, and for years, maybe decades, the explanation you found for all of this was the same one. Something is wrong with you. You're too anxious, too introverted, too sensitive, too distracted, too intense, too strange. The world offered you labels that described symptoms but never causes. Anxiety, depression, ADHD, social difficulties, low self-esteem. You accepted those labels because they were the only ones available. And you spent years trying to fix yourself based on a diagnosis that was never yours, what nobody told you, what the mental health system still cannot say with any consistency, is that there might be a neurological reason for all of this, a different way of processing the world that is not a defect, not a disease, not something that needs to be cured. It's a spectrum, and this video is for anyone who has never seriously considered the possibility that they might be on it. Before any of the signs, we need to talk about the biggest problem in the conversation about autism today. The diagnosis is broken, not the concept, the system. For decades, autism was diagnosed based on a very specific and very limited profile. Male child with severe communication difficulties, visible repetitive behaviors, and often associated intellectual disability. That was the face of autism that the textbooks showed. That was the profile doctors were trained to identify. The problem is that this is only one point on a spectrum that extends far beyond it. In 2013, the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is the Bible of Western psychiatry, made a historic revision. It unified what had previously been separate diagnoses: Asperger's syndrome, high-functioning autism, pervasive developmental disorder, into a single category called Autism Spectrum Disorder, or ASD. That was both a step forward and a new problem at the same time. The step forward. It recognized that autism is not a fixed point, but an enormous variation of ways of being and processing the world. The new problem. The diagnostic system hasn't caught up with that vision. Doctors are still trained primarily to identify the classic profile. People who don't fit that profile. Women, high-functioning individuals, people who have spent years learning to mask their traits, continue passing through clinics receiving wrong diagnosis or no diagnosis at all. Researcher Simon Baron-Cohen at the University of Cambridge estimates that autistic women are diagnosed on average 8 years later than autistic men. 8 years of life with the wrong explanation for who you are. And there's another phenomenon that science has only recently started naming, and it's essential for understanding everything in this video. It's called masking, or autistic camouflage. It's the process by which people on the spectrum learn, over years of exposure to negative social feedback, to suppress and disguise their autistic traits. They learn to make eye contact even when it's physically uncomfortable. They learn to imitate appropriate facial expressions. They learn to hide stimming, the repetitive movements that regulate the nervous system. They learn to pretend they understood a joke when they didn't. They learn to pretend they're not in sensory overload when they absolutely are. Masking is an impressive adaptive skill, and it has a devastating cost. Or the opposite. Do you seek out sensory intensity in ways that people around you find excessive? Very loud music, physical pressure, repetitive movements that have a calming effect, you've never quite been able to explain? The different relationship with sensory input is often the first and most constant sign. Sign number 2. You have deep, specific interests that other people find excessive. There's a difference between having hobbies and having what researchers call special interests. And the difference isn't intensity, it's structure. When a neurotypical person gets interested in something, the interest tends to be broad and social. They like movies in general. They talk about films with friends. They recommend titles. When an autistic person develops a special interest, the depth is different. They don't just want to consume, they want to understand the entire system. The mechanisms, the complete history, the exceptions to the rule, the connections to other systems. And that interest produces a capacity for concentration and information absorption that is genuinely extraordinary. Many of the greatest specialists in any field were, in all probability, people whose nervous systems allowed for this kind of deep immersion without effort. The social problem is that this interest doesn't scale easily to casual conversation. You talk about the thing you love with an intensity that often makes people uncomfortable or bored, not because you're dull, but because you're operating at a depth that most social conversation was never built to reach. And you feel it. You learn to hold back. You learn to notice the moment when eyes start to glaze over and change the subject. You learn to mask the enthusiasm so you don't scare people off. That has a cost. Because special interests aren't just hobbies. For many people on the spectrum, they're the primary source of joy, emotional regulation, and meaning. When you learn to suppress them in order to be accepted, you lose access to the mechanism that most helps you exist well. Sign number 3. Social interactions are cognitive, not intuitive. For most neurotypical people, social interaction is automatic. They don't think, now I need to make eye contact. Now I should tilt my head slightly to show I'm listening. Now it's appropriate to laugh. It just happens, without processing. For many people on the spectrum, this is a conscious and constant process. Have you ever analyzed a conversation after it ended? Not out of anxiety, but in an attempt to understand what happened. Do you study the people around you to learn how to behave in social contexts? Do you have explicit rules in your head for situations that other people navigate by instinct? Simon Baron-Cohen developed the theory of systematic empathy, the idea that autistic brains tend to be extraordinarily good at identifying systems and patterns, and that this applies to human behavior as well. But while for neurotypicals this reading is automatic and emotional, for people on the spectrum it often goes through the prefrontal cortex by la Spectru, through explicit reasoning. This does not mean a lack of empathy. It means empathy with a different structure. In fact, recent research, particularly the work of researcher Damian Milton on what she calls the double empathy problem, suggests that the communication difficulty between autistic and neurotypical people is not one-sided. Autistic people communicate well with other autistic people. Neurotypicals communicate well with other neurotypicals. When the two meet, there's noise in both directions, not just on the autistic side. But the world was built by and for neurotypical people, so the burden of adaptation almost always falls on only one side. Sign number 4. You have a particular relationship with rules. You either love them or question them radically. This sign shows up in apparently opposite ways but with the same underlying root. Some people on the spectrum have enormous difficulty with implicit rules, the unwritten social norms that most people absorb without needing anyone to explain them. Why is it inappropriate to call someone more than twice with no answer? Why is there a socially acceptable amount of time to wait before responding to a message? Why is humor welcome in some contexts, and the exact same joke would be offensive in others? For the autistic brain that processes rules explicitly, the absence of clear logic in many social norms is genuinely confusing, not from a lack of intelligence, but from an excess of literality. If the rule was never stated, How do you know it exists? If it has no apparent logic, why should it be followed? But the other side of the spectrum exists too, and it's equally revealing. Some people on the spectrum attach intensely to rules when those rules exist and are clear. They have enormous difficulty with ambiguity, with last-minute changes of plan, with situations where expectations weren't explicitly defined. Injustice, even minor, even when it doesn't directly affect them, produces an emotional reaction that other people find disproportionate. That's because the sense of justice in many autistic people is absolutist in the best sense of the word. It's not conditioned by hierarchy, by social convenience, or by who is being affected. A rule is a rule. An injustice is an injustice. The power of the person committing it doesn't change the fact. Philosophically, this is what Kant would call deontological ethical thinking in its purest form, an ethics based on principles, not consequences, and it's one of the traits that, in the right context, makes autistic people some of the most honest and trustworthy people in existence. Sign number 5. You need significant time to process and recover after social interactions. Introverts need time alone after social interactions. People on the spectrum often need something more specific, a reprocessing period, almost like a system reboot. Neuroscientist Stephen Shore, who is himself autistic, describes this as the energetic cost of masking. Every hour of social interaction, where you're translating implicit norms into explicit language, calibrating your facial expression, monitoring the volume of your voice, filtering the sensory stimuli of the environment, all of that simultaneously, is extraordinarily expensive in terms of cognitive processing. The result is what the autistic community calls autistic burnout. It's not depression, though it closely resembles it. It's the nervous system requesting offline time after a period of excessive demand. Do you recognize this? The need to get home after an intense social day and simply not function for several hours. The difficulty of maintaining social performance for extended periods without a cost that accumulates. This is not weakness, it's biology. It's a nervous system that processes more and filters less, asking for what it needs to regulate itself. Sign number 6. You have a very literal way of communicating, and sometimes that creates problems. Human language is extraordinarily non-literal. Metaphors, irony, sarcasm, implication, subtext, half-statements. Most social communication carries multiple simultaneous layers of meaning that neurotypicals process automatically. For many people on the spectrum, processing is literal first. The first interpretation is always the most direct one. Irony can be detected, especially in high-functioning people who have learned to identify it, but it often requires an extra processing step. And in situations of tiredness, stress, or sensory overload, that extra step simply isn't available. This generates situations that people around you interpret as naivety, lack of humor, or irritating literalness. What it actually is a different processing of a communication system that was built for a different kind of processor. Philosophically, this touches on something Wittgenstein spent his entire life exploring: the limits of language. The way words carry more than they say. For someone who processes language literally, the language games Wittgenstein described are not automatic. They're systems that need to be learned explicitly, one by one, with effort. And when it works, when the autistic person masters those systems sufficiently, they often become extraordinarily precise communicators, because precision isn't a defect of literal processing. It's a byproduct of it. Sign number 7. Routine and predictability are more than preferences, they're regulatory necessities. There's a difference between liking routine and needing routine in order to function well. For many people on the spectrum, routine isn't comfort, it's infrastructure. It's the system by which the world becomes predictable enough to navigate without consuming all available energy on processing novelty. Think about it this way. If your nervous system is constantly processing more stimuli with less automatic filtering and spending additional energy translating social norms into explicit language, any variable that can be fixed frees up resources for what can't be predicted. Routine is cognitive load management. Unexpected changes, even small ones, even ones that are objectively unimportant, can produce a reaction that seems disproportionate to anyone who doesn't understand the function of routine in the system. It's not rigidity of character. It's a nervous system that was organized around a set of expectations being abruptly reorganized. Temple Grandin, researcher, university professor, and one of the best-known autistic people in the world, describes the need for routine as fundamental to her productivity, not as a limitation, as a structure that liberates. Within the predictable structure, she can operate with the full intensity of her processing. Outside of it, a significant portion of that processing goes toward restabilization. Sign number 8. You experience emotions with different intensity and have difficulty regulating or identifying them. There's a concept called alexithymia that appears with significantly higher frequency in people on the spectrum than in the general population. It's the difficulty of identifying and describing your own emotional states. It's not the absence of emotion. That's one of the biggest myths about autism. It's difficulty accessing emotional language, knowing what you're feeling while you're feeling it, having words for internal states that exist and are intense, but that arrive without a label. This can manifest as apparent emotional coldness. The person doesn't seem to react to what should provoke a reaction. But internally, the emotional state might be extremely intense, just not reaching the surface in a form that's recognizable to others. And it can manifest in the opposite, what researchers call an autistic meltdown. An emotional collapse that seems disproportionate to the immediate trigger because the immediate trigger wasn't what caused it. What caused it was an accumulation of sensory overload, of social cost, of emotional regulation under pressure that reached its limit. What appears to be about the wrong restaurant is really about 3 weeks of constant adaptation, reaching the saturation point. Sign number 10. You always knew you were different, but never had the right word for it. This is the hardest sign to name and the most universal among people who receive a late autism diagnosis. It's not the feeling of being different in the sense of being special. It's something more specific and more uncomfortable, the persistent feeling that there's a manual for how to be human that everyone else received and you didn't, that there's a frequency on which the people around you communicate that you can pick up, but that requires constant effort to tune into. Temple Grandin described this as feeling like an anthropologist on Mars, observing a species that is technically your own, but whose behavior requires study and analysis rather than intuition. Many adults who receive a late diagnosis describe the moment of that diagnosis not as a disturbing revelation, but as a relieving confirmation, like finally putting a name to something that was always there, like understanding that the effort they made their entire lives to function wasn't weakness. It was the cost of operating in a world built for a different operating system than theirs. Philosopher and autistic researcher Damian Milton coined the term double empathy problem to capture something important. The communication difficulty between autistic and neurotypical people is not an autistic defect. It's a systems incompatibility that operates in both directions, but whose historical burden has been placed unilaterally on the autistic side. Which means that your entire life, you may have been interpreting an incompatibility as a personal flaw. It wasn't. I need to pause here and talk about something that goes beyond the signs. We're living in a very specific historical moment in the understanding of neurodivergence. Science is revising decades of assumptions. The diagnostic system is trying to catch up with what research has already found. And in the meantime, there's an entire generation of people, adults in their 20s, 30s, 40s, who grew up with no name for what they were. That has consequences that go beyond the individual. The autism spectrum is described clinically in 3 levels of support, not levels of capacity, not of intelligence, not of worth. Support. Level 1 requires support. People who function independently in many contexts, but experience significant difficulties in social communication and behavioral flexibility that affect quality of life. This is where most late diagnoses fall. It's where masking is most intense and most costly, because the ability to adapt externally hides the internal difficulty. How these people see the world. With an attention to detail that frequently goes unnoticed by others. With a sense of justice that doesn't make hierarchical concessions. With the capacity to go deep into a system or area, with an intensity that produces extraordinary knowledge. And with a particular loneliness. The loneliness of someone who learns early that showing who they really are costs a great deal socially. Level 2 requires substantial support, more visible social communication difficulties, greater behavioral rigidity, a more evident need for routine and predictability, harder to mask, less invisible, often diagnosed earlier, but still frequently misunderstood in terms of actual capacity versus needed support profile. How these people see the world, with a radical honesty that the social world frequently can't receive. With very clear preferences that society interprets as stubbornness but that are legitimate communications about legitimate needs. With ways of expressing affection that don't go through conventional channels and that are frequently ignored or dismissed because they aren't recognized for what they are. Level 3 requires very substantial support. Severe verbal and non-verbal communication difficulties, highly restrictive and repetitive behaviors, great difficulty with changes, often associated with other conditions. This is the profile closest to what the popular imagination has as autism, and even here, there is much that the conventional system still doesn't know how to see. How these people see the world. With an internal richness that frequently has no channel of expression that the world knows how to receive. Researchers like Michelle Dawson have shown that standardized intelligence tests systematically underestimate the cognitive abilities of level 3 autistic people because the tests were designed for specific types of responses that aren't natural for those people. We are in a diagnostic crisis that has several layers. The first layer is the overdiagnosis of conditions that share symptoms with autism. Generalized anxiety, depression, ADHD, borderline personality disorder, all of these can coexist with autism, but they can also be diagnoses that treat the surface without touching the root. They medicate the anxiety without understanding that the anxiety is the cost of masking. They treat the depression without understanding that it's the consequence of years of self-concept, built on the idea that you are deficient when you're not, you're just different. The second layer is the underdiagnosis in historically ignored groups. Autistic women are diagnosed later because they learn to mask better. They're socialized to perform emotional connection in ways that disguise autistic traits. Black and Latino people are systematically underdiagnosed because the healthcare system reaches them less, and because the diagnostic instruments were developed in very specific contexts that don't account for cultural variation. The third layer is the most philosophical and the most important. We live in an era that pathologizes difference before attempting to understand it. Philosopher and psychiatrist Georges Canguilhem wrote in the mid-20th century about the difference between normal and normative, between what is statistically common and what is imposed as a standard. Most psychiatric diagnoses are defined by deviation from the average, not by intrinsic suffering, by nonconformity with what is expected. And the question that is being raised with growing force is, where does the legitimate diagnosis of something that causes real suffering end, and where does the attempt to normalize what is simply different begin? For autism, the answer is not simple. There is real suffering associated with the spectrum, not because the autistic brain is defective, but because the world was built without considering that there is more than one valid way of processing reality. The solution isn't to cure autism. It's to build a world that accommodates more than one operating system. If you got this far and something resonated in a way you didn't expect, if you recognized yourself in 2, 3, 5 of these signs in a way that goes beyond casual identification, I want to say something to you directly. This is not a diagnosis. This video does not replace specialized professional evaluation. And seeking that evaluation with a neuropsychologist or psychiatrist who has specific training in ASD in adults is a step worth considering seriously. But I want to tell you something that may be more important than the diagnosis itself. The way you process the world is not an error. It's a variation. Ancient, documented, present in every human culture across all of recorded history. People who see patterns where others see chaos, who go deep where others stay on the surface, who feel with an intensity that the world frequently doesn't know how to receive, who prefer precision to social convenience and pay a price for that which is rarely acknowledged. Many of the most significant advances in science, art, philosophy, and technology were produced by people who almost certainly were on the spectrum, not despite how they processed the world, because of it. Darwin spent decades cataloging variations in nature with an obsession that most people would find excessive. Tesla had a set of sensory and routine behaviors that would be immediately recognizable today. Wittgenstein was famous for his literalness, his intensity of focus, and his difficulty in conventional social relationships. Einstein didn't speak until he was 4 years old. I'm not romanticizing suffering. I'm not saying it's easy or that it doesn't matter. I'm saying that the narrative that autism is only deficit is incomplete and in significant parts wrong. The autism spectrum is a different way of being human. Not the only way. Not the best way. Not a worse way. A different way. And in an era when the world is finally beginning to develop vocabulary for that difference. When adults who spent decades with no name for what they were are finding community, context, and understanding, perhaps this is the most important moment in history to seriously ask the question that many of you have never asked. What if the way I've always seen the world wasn't a problem to be solved, but simply how I am? That question doesn't have an easy answer, but it's the right question. And sometimes the right question is everything you need to begin to understand. If something here named something you felt but didn't have words for, share it with someone who might need to hear it. See you in the next one.